Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Harmon. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a compliance analyst at a mid-sized financial firm in Columbus, Ohio. And I want to tell you something about my job before I tell you anything else about this story, because it matters. My entire job, every single day, is to find the things people are trying to hide. Discrepancies in records, numbers that don't quite line up, patterns that look normal on the surface but feel wrong when you stare at them long enough. I'm good at it, really good at it. My boss calls me a human anomaly detector. My coworkers joke that I could spot a lie in a spreadsheet from across the room. I find it funny now. I didn't find it funny 8 months ago, when I realized I had been completely missing the lie that was sitting across the breakfast table from me every single morning. His name was Daniel. My husband of 4 years, Daniel Harmon. He had warm brown eyes, the kind of laugh that filled a whole room, and a habit of leaving his cereal bowl in the sink instead of putting it in the dishwasher, no matter how many times I asked. We'd been together for 6 years total. I loved him the way you love something you built together, carefully, over time, with a lot of small, ordinary moments stacked one on top of the other, until they become something that feels permanent. I want you to understand something. I'm telling you this not to get your sympathy, but because I need you to understand how completely ordinary things looked from the outside. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden coldness, no cliched late nights or lipstick on collars. Daniel was warm, he was present. He told me he loved me on a Tuesday morning in February, while I was still half asleep, and he was putting on his coat and heading out the door. That was the same week I first noticed the number. It was a small thing. $43. That's what it started with. A $43 withdrawal from our joint checking account that I couldn't account for. Now, most people would not notice $43. Most people would assume it was gas, or lunch, or something their partner grabbed at the grocery store and forgot to mention. But I'm not most people. And the thing about working in financial compliance is that small, unexplained numbers have a way of being the first sentence of a much longer story. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I just made a note. In my phone, in a private folder I keep for work reminders. I wrote $43, cash withdrawal, Tuesday, February 7th. And then I waited to see what happened next. The next one came 9 days later, $60 this time, also cash, also a weekday. Also with no mention from Daniel, no receipt on the counter, no explanation offered. And I want to tell you, I sat with that second one longer than I sat with the first. Because one withdrawal is nothing. One withdrawal is a forgotten coffee, a parking meter, a vending machine craving at 2 in the afternoon. 2 withdrawals, 9 days apart, from a man who considered physical cash to be slightly beneath him. That was something else. That was a behavior, and behaviors have reasons. I want you to understand something about cash withdrawal specifically, because this is the part that made my skin go cold, even at this early stage. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years, and in 4 years, I could count on one hand the number of times he had made a cash withdrawal from our account. We were a digital household. Apple Pay, credit cards, Venmo, bank transfers. Daniel actively complained about carrying cash. He used to joke that physical money felt like a prop from an old movie. So 2 cash withdrawals in 9 days was not normal. For most couples, it would be a minor quirk. For Daniel specifically, it was the equivalent of a red flare. I still said nothing. I know some of you are already wondering why I didn't just ask him. And I want to be honest with you. Part of me wanted to. There's a version of me that could have walked into the kitchen that Thursday evening, held up my phone showing the transaction, and said, "Hey, what's this?" and maybe gotten an innocent explanation. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was a completely reasonable answer I just hadn't thought of. But here's the thing about working in compliance for 7 years. You learn that when you tip someone off that you're watching, the paper trail gets cleaner. People who are hiding something don't stop hiding it when you ask them about it. They just get more careful. And if there was nothing to find, I would feel foolish for 10 minutes, and then we'd move on. But if there was something to find, if my instincts were right, then tipping my hand early would cost me everything. So I kept quiet. And I watched. By mid-March, the withdrawals were happening every week. $50, $80, sometimes $100, always cash, always during the weekday. And then, on a rainy Saturday in late March, I found the second thing. Daniel had left his personal laptop open on the kitchen counter, something he almost never did. He'd stepped outside to take a phone call, which itself was slightly unusual because he usually took calls in the living room where I could see him. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't even looking. I was just walking past to get a glass of water, and I happened to glance down. There was an email open on the screen, just a confirmation email, from an apartment rental company. The subject line said, Lease Renewal Confirmation, Unit 4B, Westbrook Commons. I read it in approximately 3 seconds before I kept walking to the cabinet, got my glass of water, and stood at the sink with my back to the laptop, running water over my hands that I didn't need to wash, just so I had a reason to stand there and breathe. An apartment. Daniel was renewing a lease on an apartment. We owned our house together. We'd bought it 18 months ago. There was no reason, no professional reason, no family reason, no logical reason at all, for Daniel to be maintaining a separate apartment in a complex 12 minutes from where we lived. I walked back through the kitchen, didn't look at the laptop, went upstairs, sat on the edge of our bed, and stared at the wall for a very long time. And if you've ever dealt with a moment where something shifts so fundamentally that the world just looks a little different on the other side of it, then you already know how this part feels. You don't cry, you don't scream, you just go very, very still. I went back downstairs when I heard Daniel come in from outside. I made dinner. I asked him about his day. I laughed at something he said. I watched him across the table with new eyes. The same warm eyes, the same easy laugh, and I felt something go quiet inside me. Something that had been soft became careful. That night I opened a new folder on my personal laptop. I called it Home Budget Planning, and that's where the real documentation began. Before I go any further, I want to stop and say something to anyone watching right now who might be in a situation that feels like this one. That moment of stillness, when you know something is wrong but you haven't confirmed it yet, is one of the loneliest feelings I have ever experienced. Because you can't talk to anyone. You can't tell your friends, because what would you even say? I think my husband has a secret apartment. You can't talk to your family because they'll panic. You're just sitting inside this terrible knowledge, completely alone, pretending everything is fine. If you know what that feels like, I'm sorry. I really am. And please keep watching, because I want to tell you what comes after the stillness. April and May were the months I spent learning everything. I want to be clear that I did not go through Daniel's phone. I did not hire a private investigator. I did not follow him or surveil him in any way that crossed a legal or ethical line. What I did was methodically review every financial record I had legal access to, our joint account, my own account, the receipts that came into our shared email for household expenses, credit card statements, and slowly the picture assembled itself with the cold precision of a puzzle, built by someone who didn't want it to be solved. The cash withdrawals totaled just over $3,000 by the end of April. There was also a charge to a home goods store I'd never heard of, $212. There was a charge to a grocery delivery service that used a different address than ours. There was a streaming service subscription under Daniel's name that wasn't tied to any device in our house. The apartment was real. It was being paid for through a personal account Daniel maintained that I knew about in theory. He'd always called it his rainy day money from before we married, but that I had never closely examined because I'd respected his financial privacy. I used my compliance skills to legally request our joint financial statements going back 18 months. What I found made my stomach turn. Transfers from our joint account to his personal account, small ones, irregular ones, ones that fell just below the threshold that might trigger a conversation, had been happening for over a year. The total came to just under $11,000. $11,000. Moved quietly, carefully, in a pattern that was clearly designed to avoid detection by someone who knew what detection looked like. He had studied this, he had thought about it, and that specific detail was the moment I stopped grieving and started planning. June was the hardest month, not because of what I discovered, but because of what I had to perform. By June I had confirmed, through a combination of financial records, a single afternoon of legally permissible observation from a public space, and a very careful conversation with a divorce attorney named Paula, who became the most important person in my life for the next few months, that Daniel was maintaining a relationship with another woman in that apartment. I won't spend too much time on her. She doesn't need to be the center of this story. She may not have known about me, and honestly, that's a question I eventually stopped caring about. What I cared about was this. Daniel had been systematically financially defrauding me, using our shared marital assets to fund a hidden life. And Pennsylvania law, actually Ohio law, where we lived, has very specific things to say about marital asset dissipation. Paula explained it to me over 2 meetings, very calmly, in a voice that reminded me of a woman who had seen this exact situation so many times she had developed a specific gentleness for it. She said, "The more documentation you have, the cleaner this is going to be for you." So I documented. And every evening in June and July and August, I sat across from Daniel at dinner, and I smiled, and I asked about his day, and I let him talk, and I stored every interaction in a part of my mind that had become very cold and very clear. And then I came upstairs and I added notes to my folder labeled Home Budget Planning, and I waited. There were moments. I want to be honest about the moments. There was a Sunday in July when Daniel made me coffee exactly the way I like it, and brought it upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed while I was reading and just said, "I'm really glad you're in my life, Rach." And I had to smile and say me too, and the thing is, part of me still meant it. Part of me was grieving the person I thought he was. Part of me was genuinely, quietly devastated. I cried exactly twice during those 8 months, both times in the shower. Both times with the water running hot enough that I couldn't tell which drops were water and which were not. But I did not break, and I did not tip my hand. I need to tell you about the near miss, because it was almost the thing that undid everything. It was a Wednesday evening in early September. Daniel came home a little later than usual, and he was quieter than usual, and I remember noticing both of these things and filing them away. We ate dinner. We watched part of a show. He went to bed before me, which was unusual. I came to bed maybe an hour later, and he was still awake, and he turned to look at me in the dark, and he said, "Rachel, is everything okay with you?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "You've just seemed a little distant lately, like you're somewhere else." And I had to lie there in the dark, next to this man, and tell him that everything was fine, that I'd just been stressed at work, that I was sorry if I'd seemed distracted. I had to make my voice soft and a little tired and completely ordinary. He reached over and held my hand and said okay, and within 15 minutes he was asleep. I lay there for a long time after that, not crying, just thinking about the particular cruelty of being the person who knows, trapped in a situation where knowing is the thing you cannot afford to reveal. And I thought about Paula's voice saying, "The more documentation you have, the cleaner this is going to be for you." And I held on to that. October was when I finished building the case. Paula had helped me understand exactly what I needed. Not just the financial records, which by this point were organized and annotated and presented in a format that would have made my most demanding supervisor proud, but also the apartment lease documentation I had obtained legally through a public records inquiry. The timeline, the dissipation amounts. Everything cataloged, everything sourced, everything clean. Paula sat across from me in her office on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and she looked through my folder for a long time. And then she looked up and said, "Rachel, this is one of the most thorough documentation packages I've seen from a client who wasn't a lawyer." I said, "I work in compliance." She said, "I can tell." She said we were ready to file. She said that given the documented financial dissipation and the clear pattern of asset transfer, I was in an extremely strong position. She said the process would take some time, but that my outcome was about as predictable as these things ever get. I asked her, "When should we file?" She said, "When do you want to?" And I sat there for a moment and I thought about a specific date, because there was one more thing I needed to do. Not for the case was already complete. For me, one final moment of clarity, I said, "December 26th. She looked at me. "The day after Christmas?" I said, "Yes." Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, and for 4 years it had been Daniel's and mine together. We always spent Christmas Eve with my family and Christmas Day with his parents, his sister Joanna, her husband, and their 2 kids. It was loud and warm and chaotic in the way that large family Christmases are, and I had always loved it. I know what you're thinking. I know how this part sounds, but I want to explain something. I didn't do it to cause a scene. I didn't do it to ruin anyone's Christmas or to humiliate Daniel in front of his family. I want to be very clear about that. I am not that kind of person, and that is not what happened. What happened was that I went to his family's Christmas because they were my family too. For 4 years, they had been my family, and I wanted one last normal day with them. I wanted to sit at that table one more time and eat his mother's cooking and watch his nephew open presents and feel, for a few hours, the ghost of the life I had built and was about to dismantle. Daniel was warm and easy and charming the way he always was. His mother hugged me. Joanna and I talked in the kitchen while we were helping clear dishes. His nephew showed me a video game he'd gotten as a gift. It was achingly normal. And at the end of the night, driving home, Daniel reached over and put his hand on mine on the center console, and he said, "Good Christmas, huh?" I said, "Yeah, really good." And I meant it, in a way. I meant it as a goodbye. The next morning, December 26th, I got up before Daniel. I made coffee, I showered and got dressed. I texted Paula, ready. She filed the paperwork at 9 a.m. I was sitting in our kitchen when Daniel's phone rang. His own lawyer, it turned out. Someone Paula had notified as part of the process, as required. I heard Daniel's footsteps go still upstairs. Then I heard them move. Quickly, he came downstairs and he stood in the kitchen doorway and he looked at me. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. He said, "Rachel," I said, "good morning." He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I filed for divorce. The paperwork should be on your phone." His face went through about 6 different expressions in 10 seconds. Shock, confusion, something that tried to arrange itself into indignation and didn't quite make it. He said, "Where is this coming from? Why are you? Rachel, this doesn't make any sense." And this is the moment I had been carrying inside me for 8 months. This exact moment. I set my coffee cup down. I looked at him, and I said very quietly, "Daniel, I know about the apartment at Westbrook Commons. I know about the account transfers. I know about the $11,000. I have documentation going back 18 months, and my attorney has all of it." The kitchen was very quiet for a long time. He sat down in the chair across from me, not the chair he usually sat in, which I noticed, and he put his face in his hands. He didn't deny it. That surprised me a little. I had been prepared for denial. I had been prepared for anger, for deflection, for the kind of reflexive gaslighting that I had read enough about to recognize. But Daniel just sat there with his face in his hands, and he said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" I said. "Since February." He looked up. His eyes were red. He said, "You knew for 8 months, and you didn't say anything." I said, "No, I spent 8 months making sure you couldn't take anything else from me." The divorce process took 4 months. It was not easy, I won't pretend it was. There were hard phone calls and harder silences and nights where the house felt enormous and empty, and I wondered if I had made the right choices at every single step. There were also moments of dark, specific humor that I wasn't prepared for. Like the Tuesday afternoon, I realized I needed to find a new password for the streaming account and discovered Daniel had been using the password RachelBaby1 for his secret personal email. I sat there for 5 full minutes, not sure whether to laugh or throw my laptop across the room. I eventually chose to laugh because it seemed healthier. There was a night in February when I drove past Westbrook Commons. I don't know why I did it. I had no reason to go that direction. But I found myself turning into the street at 9 p.m. on a dark Wednesday and driving slowly past the building, a beige, ordinary apartment complex with a parking lot and some sad decorative bushes. And I thought, this is what $11,000 bought. Beige walls and sad bushes. And something in me let go of a tension I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. But Paula had been right. The documentation made it clean. The dissipation claim was upheld. The asset division reflected the reality of what had been taken. Daniel did not fight it. Perhaps because he couldn't, given what was in my folder. Or perhaps because some part of him recognized that he owed me this. I don't know. I stopped spending energy trying to understand him around month 2 of the process. His family called me. His mother called me once, in January, and we talked for almost an hour. She cried. I cried. There was nothing either of us could say that fixed anything. But she said to me at the end of the call, "You didn't deserve this, Rachel. I need you to know that. I know that." And I held on to that more than I expected to. Joanna texted me in March. She said, "I'm so sorry. For everything. You were always the right one for him, and he was an idiot, and I'm sorry." I read that text probably 6 times. I want to tell you something about the 8 months of silence. Because I've had people in my life, a few close friends I eventually told the full story to, who reacted with something close to discomfort, who said things like, "Why didn't you just confront him?" Or, "I don't know if I could have stayed that quiet, and here is what I've come to believe. Silence is not the same as weakness. Patience is not the same as passivity. There is a specific kind of strength in choosing not to react, in letting a situation continue to reveal itself while you stand back and watch and wait and document and plan. It is not the dramatic strength of a big confrontation. It is quieter than that. But in my experience, it is more durable. I also want to be honest about what the 8 months cost me. They cost me a lot. I lost sleep. I performed a version of my life that wasn't real for an extended period of time, and that kind of sustained performance is exhausting in ways that are hard to explain. I grieved my marriage in real time, in private, while living inside it. That is not something I would wish on anyone. But I am also, genuinely, okay. I have a small apartment now, in a neighborhood I love, that is entirely mine. I have a life that is quiet in a way that feels chosen rather than imposed. I have my work, which I am good at, and a few close friends who know the full story and love me anyway, and a cat I adopted in May whose name is Tuesday, because that's when I first noticed the $43, and I figured she deserved a name with some meaning to it. I don't talk about Daniel often. I don't harbor rage toward him, which surprises people. I think rage requires ongoing energy, and I made a decision somewhere in the middle of all of this that my energy was a resource I needed to spend carefully. What I do feel occasionally is a specific quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from revenge, because what I did was not revenge, it was protection, but from knowing that I acted with intention, that I didn't make choices out of panic or emotion, that I gathered every fact available to me, and I waited until I was in the strongest possible position, and then I moved. I think about something my grandmother used to say. She was a woman who had survived a lot of hard things in her life, and she had a way of saying difficult truths very simply. She used to say, "The people who hurt you are always counting on you to react before you're ready." I was ready. There's one last thing I want to tell you, and then I'll let you go. About 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Daniel at a grocery store, which sounds like a rom-com moment, but was actually just an ordinary Tuesday morning. He was in the cereal aisle, which I found grimly appropriate, and we both stopped when we saw each other. It was a few seconds of that particular discomfort, where neither person knows quite what with their face or their body. And then he said, "Hey, Rachel." And I said, "Hey." And he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Really well, actually." "You?" And he said, "Yeah, okay. You know," and he kind of gestured vaguely in a way that said everything and nothing at the same time. And I said, "Okay, well, take care of yourself." And I pushed my cart past him, and I didn't look back. And that's it. That's the whole story. I'm 31 years old. I work in compliance. I have a cat named Tuesday. And I know, better than most people, that the truth doesn't hide forever. It just waits in the numbers until someone patient enough looks carefully. Thank you for listening.